Thank you so much, Jordan. So now we move back over to the opposition. And speaking second in opposition tonight is Professor Rosie Campbell. Professor Campbell is a professor of politics and the director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. She's held positions at Birkbeck and UCL before joining King's in 2017. She has recently written on barriers to participation in politics, gendered patterns of support for the populist radical right, and what voters want from their elected representatives. Professor Campbell, you have the floor.
Well, I have also read Richard Reeve's book and think it's absolutely fantastic. So I think there is a slight danger that we are arguing on the head of a pin here, in that I think the four of us, probably in terms of what we would like to see from the world, we all agree. As you've said, I direct the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College. The chair of the institute is Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia. And she had a pretty difficult time when she was Prime Minister, subject to what some feminists might call toxic masculinity. And had a very famous speech, an anti-misogyny speech that many of you may have seen. The Institute is all about trying to accelerate women's access to leadership roles and to kind of get rid of the stereotypes that face women in those positions. And I've been in this role for 6 years, and I'm constantly in rooms with other women. And this is a massive problem, because I think, although we agree, I think there is a problem with the motion in terms of what I think it leads us to in terms of solution. So this House believes masculinity has failed men. It's my contention that masculinity has not failed men, and I'm afraid I have to put my hands up here. I think it's rather the language of feminism that has not evolved to communicate effectively about gender equality. And this has limited our capacity to foster genuine coalitions. We are on the same side, and yet publicly, sometimes it seems as if we're not. And that is often not entirely the fault of feminism, but we have a lot to blame. So I believe that that the policies and programmes that would make lives better for the boys and men that you're talking about are not in any way in conflict with the programmes that make lives better for women and girls. They're two sides of exactly the same coin. But you wouldn't think that to look at the culture wars debates in our media, would you? And so I think one of the reasons for this is we've really failed to communicate that gender equality is good for everybody. But before I proceed to develop that argument, first let us briefly consider the extent to which there is evidence that men have been failed at all by anything. Well, globally, progress towards gender equality has been painfully slow. Men still dominate leadership positions around the world, and they control the majority of global finance. In many places, women don't have basic human rights. Think about Afghanistan, think about Saudi Arabia, where women's rights activists are currently in jail, and think about the incidents of violence against women and girls around the world. However, those global statistics mask a variation within and between countries, as been mentioned today. In many post-industrial nations, on several metrics, significant subgroups of men are seriously disadvantaged. Think about African American men and the way they're so often treated by the criminal justice system and policing. If we didn't think about men and the disadvantages they face, we would miss that absolutely enormous problem. And in the UK, working class men are falling behind in some areas. At this moment in time in the UK, 57% of university students are women. That was never the goal of feminism. The goal was equality. We've already heard about mental health and the massively higher suicide rate amongst men than women. And another area of inequality is parenthood. It's much harder in our society for men to be involved parents than it is for women. They don't get the same access to entitlements to leaves. And yet, it has always been my understanding, as put beautifully by Mary Shear in 1986, that feminism is the radical notion that women are people. And when I got this job, my mum's one of those sort of anti-feminist women. And she said to me, I literally got the phone call from Julie Gillard, we're going to hire you. I'm jumping around, I'm absolutely delighted. Tried to get hold of my husband, he's in a bloody meeting. Next person, get hold of my mum. Well, don't you think women are people, Rosie? That's the whole bloody point. But It's, the fact is she didn't get that. And a lot of people don't get that. And actually, feminism, the goal has always been gender equality, not women's empowerment. And yet, too often, we hear feminism and we think women and we don't think about the problems facing men. And that's on us. Thus, if we see evidence that men and boys, on specific groups of men and boys, are disadvantaged, feminists should be equally concerned to address these inequalities as those faced by women and girls. And yet, in public discourse, this is just not well understood, as exemplified by my mother. And there are some reasons for this. There have been historical waves of backlash against feminists, portraying them as man-hating, etc. But it's also about infighting within feminism between loosely called radical and liberal feminists, where we're all too often in rooms arguing with each other and speaking past everybody else. And I think that the example of toxic masculinity is a really good example of this. It might be quite useful in a feminist debate to use toxic masculinity the way you described it. I think of Putin. I don't think of any men I know. I think of, the really most kind of toxic behaviour. And of course, feminists, most of us would say that isn't linked to sex. It's a performance. It's a deliberate performance. But my fear is that lots of men, and particularly young men, don't hear that. What they hear is, you are bad, you are dangerous, you just keep away from our daughters. And that isn't the message that feminists should want to convey or should be conveying. And some examples, I think, of how this is bearing out is some research we did at the Global Institute with Ipsos Mori for International Women's Day this year. We found that among 16 to 29-year-olds, 37% of young men felt the term toxic masculinity was unhelpful, compared to 47% of young women who thought it was helpful. Now, given the problem is two sides of the same coin, it can't be useful if young men and young women are seeing this in such a different way. An even starker contrast was when the respondents to the survey were asked, what do you think the world's going to look like in 20 years' time? Is it going to be better or worse for men versus women? And in that age group of 16 to 29, 30% of young men thought the world would be worse for men than women in 20 years' time, and 48% of young women thought it would be worse for women than men. So we are just not in the same conversation in Gen Z. And that is a massive problem, and I can't help but think that using words like toxic masculinity really aid and fuel that polarisation. So what we need is initiatives that connect gender equality so that we think about the needs of women and girls and the needs of men and boys. But my concern is that if we accept this motion today, then we say masculinity is the problem, so masculinity must be the solution. But what would that entail? How would we avoid returning to the damaging and constraining gender stereotypes that limit men and women's ability to be their true selves? Would positive masculinity only be something that's available to men? And if we do that, will it not just continue the false dichotomy between men and women and the roles that they can fulfill? I think it would be much more effective for us to show boys and girls how the concepts of masculine and femininity have been shaped in order to actually limit our choices. Let's think about the example of education. So in child development terms, it makes perfect sense. You land in this world and you look around you and you think, okay, what kind of thing am I? What kind of rules apply to me? And you notice, well, I'm in this male body, I'm in this female body, all the teachers are women. Well, that's something that boys don't do then. That's education suddenly becomes coded feminine. Well, what's the solution to that? Do we then want to code teaching as masculine and say that male teachers have something special to offer? And what does that mean then for male teachers who don't want to perform that special kind of, ultra sporty masculinity or whatever it is? Would it not be better just to get more men into teaching and then stress that education doesn't have a gender either masculine or feminine? It's for everybody. And so to conclude, I do not believe that it's masculinity that's failed men, but incomplete progress towards gender equality and the failure to understand that gender equality isn't just making things better for women, it's making things better for everyone. And it's time to debunk the masculine stereotypes that limit men's life choices by showing that in most settings, most of the time, gender and sex, masculinity and femininity are not the most salient human characteristics. And we can do this through an open conversation that is truly inclusive for everybody.